My name is Joshua Piers, and welcome to Proc HTTP, using the web to combat fraud in auto finance during a global pandemic. I work for GM Financial. We are the finance arm of General Motors, and 2020 was a particularly challenging year. I know for a lot of people in a lot of businesses all over the world. And so I'm going to talk to you today about how it was challenging for us specifically in certain ways, and how Proc HTTP served as a very helpful solution to some of our problems that we were having. As far as a little bit of background on me, I'm a graduate from the University of North Texas. It's in Denton, Texas. I majored in applied technology and performance improvement. I started at GMF 2018, November 2018. Which is the same year I graduated, and I've been there since and have been loving it. Work in commercial analytics, help monitor everything from risk to customer satisfaction. And today we're specifically going to talk about inventory control. As far as commercial lending services goes, we primarily cover two main functions of lending for the company. There's the commercial side, where we would say maybe you were a plumber and you wanted to finance a fleet of vans for your plumbing company. We would cover that side. And then there's also the direct dealer side of commercial lending services, where we, majority of people don't know this. I didn't know this prior to starting at GMF, but dealers don't buy their cars outright. So like from GM, it's not like they hand over a bunch of cash that's theirs and say, these are our cars now. They'll finance the cars until they sell them to the consumer and pay a little bit of interest on that in that time that they have them on their lot. And so what can happen in those situations, the majority of dealerships conduct themselves in honorable ways, in respectful ways. But every once in a while you get one that things get tight and they try to take some shortcuts and do things that aren't really totally legal. At least not in our eyes, and it's our job to kind of catch them before they get in that spot. Because the result of a dealership doing that, we call it sold out of trust. And so, say a dealership were to finance a car with us, and then they were to sell that car to a customer, but then not notify us that that car had been sold. They now get the full sum of cash from that customer buying outright or financing that car, and they can use that money if they don't tell us that they sold it, to maybe float some bills. And if they continue to do that with multiple vehicles and things don't improve and they don't get that cash kind of refilled, they can be underwater in a big way, and that can impact us financially in a really bad way. And so it's in everyone's best interest for us to identify those situations early, so that no one gets financially hurt. And one of the primary ways that we do that through our inventory control system is by in-person auditing. And so pre-pandemic, what we would do is we would send a team that we contracted out to a dealership's lot, and we would have them physically count VINs on the lot. And depending on how risky, what level of risk we assign to a particular dealership, that would determine the frequency. So if a dealership was higher risk, we would have a greater frequency of them visiting these lots. And if we determined a dealership was lower risk, it would be a lower frequency. And so for some of these dealerships that we had on a higher frequency, with the many problems that the pandemic introduced on our end of things, one of the biggest was how do we monitor these cars? How do we count these cars on these lots? And I had attended I attended a global forum session in 2019, and the function that they talked about was Proc HTTP. And in my head, I was like, oh, I'm going to make a mental note. If there's ever anything I think I could use this for, like, I want to. And so with this situation where we weren't able to count cars on dealers' lots, this kind of problem came up where it's like, how are we going to monitor and how we're going to make sure that we know where our cars are and that they haven't been sold, because you had dealerships that for months were kind of closed down. They didn't have customers coming in through their doors. And we had government response, and we were very flexible in working with our customers and making sure that the dealerships were all in a good spot. But at the same time, if there's a problem that you don't know about and they're not fully communicating with you or not fully being honest with you, that can catch you really off guard and put you in a bad spot really quick. And so in these conversations, Proc HTTP was in the back of my head, and it was like, hey, how can I apply this in our situation in a way that we can use it and hopefully have it be really, really helpful. And so I got to thinking, and I decided that for sure Proc HTTP was my answer. It was my solution, and that was what we were going to use. And so the primary way I wanted to do that was by checking to see what dealers were currently advertising on their websites. The idea being, if I could monitor what a dealership was advertising on their website, I could compare that to the list of current floor plan loans that we have. And if we have an active loan for a car that a dealership isn't advertising on their website, then we need to ask that dealership some questions about where that car is and try and physically track down that specific vehicle. Because if you have a dealership that has hundreds of vehicles, you might not know which ones to ask about. And so what Proc HTTP hopefully would allow us to do, and spoiler alert, allowed us to do, is give us very specific questions to ask. Where is this specific VIN number to that specific dealer? And so I started by going to our dealership's websites and trying to identify, if I could, if VIN information was available on their websites. And lo and behold, I discovered that VIN information was the primary identifier that the dealerships were using on their websites to do their own personal inventory control for how they were displaying the inventory on their pages. And so the majority of the ones that I found in all the use cases that I was looking at, and as you can see here in the slide, have the VIN directly on their page. On the vehicle list page, it's got a VIN right there. Some of them were maybe not that blatant in your face. This is the VIN number, but on the back end in the HTML somewhere, they were using it as a unique identifier for the vehicle in their inventory, which was good news for us, because if we could grab that information, we could use it. And so what I did is I inspected, here I am in Chrome, kind of inspecting the element, and identified where that VIN, as it was displayed on the website, was stored in that HTML code. And so once I confirmed that the VIN was for sure there, I had to figure out how to grab it. And this is not something I've ever done before. I've been, as I said earlier, I started with GMF in late 2018. That's also when I started using Sass. So I'm not by any means a Sass pro at this point. I've only been coding for 2.5 years now, and so I, at this point, wasn't even sure what all was possible. There's some really great resources out there right now that you can, just simply Google and find to help you in your case. And so that's what I did here. Once I confirmed that I was able to get it, I did a lot of Googling, and I came up with a solution. On our end, there's a train passing, so I'm gonna wait for it to pass because it's gonna be kind of loud. So on our end, we have, as I'm sure most of your companies will have some sort of cybersecurity systems in place. I had to have a little bit of a tricky approach. So if you see here in my Proc HTTP statement, I've got these proxy usernames, proxy passwords, and the proxy host information. On our end, this was how I was able to, we'd use a service account because of our cybersecurity rules. And so that's what that is. You might have to do that and work with your cybersecurity teams and your SaaS admins to figure out the best way to implement for your on your end. And so for me, there was a lot of back and forth with my SaaS admins and our cybersecurity team to figure out how we were going to do it. And even now, I still, for each new dealer website that I want to access, I have to submit a ticket for that specific dealership's website to get access to the service account that we're using. And so here's the proc HTTP statement. You see the URL right there. We're grabbing that inventory page. In this specific instance, it was just it was search used was what they used, and I could display 100 vehicles per page. Most dealerships, I feel like, aren't going to have more than a couple hundred. That's kind of where a lot of them are maxed out. But in this specific instance, what I needed to do was set this page number right here, the number that they displayed per page, to 100, and then I ran that twice to get the full list. And then that gets saved as a text file, which we then import. This can be a tricky part. As I said, I'm not by any means a SaaS pro. This was the solution I found, kind of using the manual data import. This was the code that kind of got built out from that, and so I tweaked it a little bit. But it allowed me to import in a usable column format the HTML data from the dealership's website. And so once I imported that, this is what it looked like. It wasn't like this is just the raw data, unclean. So at this point, it wasn't super helpful. I had to figure out a way to do that. There's a few different solutions that you can use here. On my end, I just wanted to create a simple table and identify whether or not it's from their used or their new inventory pages, because that kind of, on our backend side, affects how we're looking at the information. And so once I did that, I got these, sorry, skip that. I got these rows, and then from there, it allowed me to grab what I needed. In order to get these rows, it's worth mentioning, I just did this little where statement, because this is where I identified the VINs in the data. That's going to be different from site to site, and that's one of the things I'll say. Every single dealer's website, unless they're part of the same group and use the exact same like base HTML code, every single website is going to have a little bit different approach that you'll need to take. But once you get set up, you should be able to automate it and check that website every single day. And so here's a little data step that I created just to kind of clean that up. Here I use PR Exchange to kind of get it down to just the VIN and the VIN number. One thing that I'm looking at doing right now is doing PRX Next and trying to identify a 16-character string and just grab that 16-character string. And but I think that's a better solution than actually what I have here. This is what I initially did, but as this has grown and morphed, I think that's going to be a better solution in the future. And at the end right here, after that step, I ended up with a clean VIN. One thing I'll say too, kind of going back a little bit, on this step right here, when you're both importing the data from the dealer website and importing the text file, I think it'd be really simple. I haven't done this yet, but I think it should be really simple to set this up on a loop to where you have it just do until you don't have anything in that text file, until that text file is blank, empty, and then just append everything together after you import it in. I personally think that's probably going to be the easiest solution there. I also want to talk about another case that we had where one of the very first dealers that I set up actually changed their website and started using a widget to determine how inventory was displayed on the site. So instead of having the HTML information on that back end, it was now the VIN information in the HTML code on the back end. It was now connected to a widget and located somewhere else on the site. And when I initially tried to import that information from that widget, it was in JSON format, and I had never tried to import anything like that before. And so you have to take a different approach here. I discovered after playing with it for a little bit, So initially, when you try to import, if you were to just, the way I previously had done it, just try to import that JSON file, it would just be one giant block. It would like just import as one giant block where you don't have any delimiters that were useful in this case anyways. And it made it really, really tricky to grab the VINs. But what I discovered with the JSON file, something else I did not know, is that you can use Proc HTTP as you did before and grab from here that API information from the dealer website and set it to a text file as you did before. And then all you need to do next is create a library name that reads that text file in JSON format, which is what I did on that very last step right there. And then what you can do, it adds a couple layers of what you have to do, but in this case, it actually imports it with a clean VIN number, which is a lot more helpful than trying to clean it up yourself. And so what you'll want to do is create a library instance for each of these pages that you're trying, because the pages max out at 100, and kind of like we talked about before. And so what you'll have to do is create a text file, and I would run this on a loop too. And then at the end here, at the end of that link where it says start equals 0, you'll just need to up that page number, and that would be the value that I would set to just change until there isn't any results that come back. And then you can take these VINs from each of these unique libraries that you created and append them all together. And if you guys mess around with that or have a case where that you find where you're using this and there's a more efficient or more simple solution, reach out to me and let me know. I'd love to hear it. And at the end of the day, in both situations, what this allowed us to do is it allowed us to grab VINs off our dealer websites and look at what they're advertising, because if they're not selling it, and they should be selling it, there's probably a reason for that. And so we were able to compare what they're advertising versus what we have a current active floor plan loan, and ask specific questions about these specific vehicles that weren't on their website, but we have an active loan for and believe they should be selling. In the case that, in the very first case that I looked at when I was initially researching the functionality of this, there were 6 VINs that did not appear on the website that we had an active loan on. We have some virtual inventory control in place, and so for some of the new VINs that were on there, we were actually able to ping those for GPS and determined that they were not on the lot, and then confirmed in the case of all 6 that they had in fact been sold recently, and were able to, contact the dealer and collect on those specific vehicles, which was great because that was the very first time we used it, and right off the bat it was like, oh, this works. This is good and useful information, which is what you always want. I know anybody who works doing what we do knows the feeling of putting a lot of work into something and then it not being helpful or useful. So it was really, I felt great about it. I was very excited about it. And the other thing it allowed us to do, and so if you work in auto finance, this will be really helpful if you're considering looking at this. The other thing that it helped us to do is it also helped us monitor inventories of dealerships who aren't on our floor plan, but we're affiliate dealerships of dealerships who are, because we have had cases where affiliate dealerships will be selling vehicles that we have a floor plan loan on that should be at a different dealership that we have a floor plan relationship with. And so it gives us the ability to monitor dealership inventories outside of just the ones that we currently do business with. Because if a VIN shows up at one of those lots and it's supposed to be at a different lot, that's problematic too. And yeah, so it created a great new kind of realm that was previously undiscovered, with this wealth of information for us to be able to tap, and just was a great new data source for us. And so hopefully this information was insightful and helpful for you guys. I know it has been for me. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Or if you, figure out ways to make the code more efficient or improve on things, again, reach out and let me know. I'd love to see how you're using it, how you're applying it. My email is joshua.peers@gmfinancial.com. And yeah, thanks for tuning in and listening. Let me know. I'll be sticking around after this to do a little bit of a Q&A, I think. So let me know if you have any questions. Thanks. Bye.